it takes a few seconds to connect, and I'll go ahead and open the webinar in just a sec. All right, folks, welcome in. I'll just give you a second to connect. So great to have you here. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So, good afternoon, bonjour et bienvenue from Concordia University's fourth space, located on unceded indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. At Fourth Space, we work with Concordia students, staff, and faculty members, as well as their industry and community partners, to activate the various research projects, university initiatives, and courses via live events. We are therefore very pleased to welcome you to The Raccoon Next Door, a discussion on animal intelligence and human-wildlife coexistence. It's been our pleasure to work with doctoral candidate in biology, Louis Lazure, to develop this event, and welcome in Sarah Benson-Amram, who works on urban forests and human health at UBC. Louis and Sarah will dialogue about animal cognition, human-wildlife coexistence, and the challenges and opportunities of studying animal behavior. I'll just note that we are streaming to YouTube, and I'll put that link in the chat in just a second. And there will be a very short kind of period for Q&A towards the end. So if you do have a burning question or comment to make, we would invite you to raise a virtual hand, and we can go ahead and unmute you so that you can speak. Otherwise, of course, the Q&A box and the chat are activated for all. Okay, on that note, it's my pleasure to pass it over to you, Louis. Welcome in.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you, Dr. Benson-Amram, for accepting to participate in this live event today. I'm a PhD student in biology. I study human-wildlife interaction and animal behavior, specifically looking at raccoons as my study subject, which is something I have in common with Dr. Benson-Amram. So today's topic, like Anna mentioned, are going to be human-wildlife interactions, animal behavior, and we'll talk about one of our favorite species, the raccoon. So thank you again, Dr. Benson-Amram. Can you tell us a bit about your affiliation? You're talking to us live from Vancouver, so you're at the UBC. Can you describe a bit your lab and an overview of your interest? And then we'll go through a short presentation that you're gonna do for us.
Sure, yes. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. It's wonderful to be here. And yes, I am joining you from the University of British Columbia, Vancouver campus, which is located on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So I feel very fortunate to be able to live and work here. I recently joined UBC. I was previously at the University of Wyoming in the States. So I've been at UBC for less than a year, but it's been really wonderful to be here and to get to know Canada a bit better. And I have a joint appointment. I'm an assistant professor with a joint appointment between the departments of zoology and the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences. And then I'm also a member of the Biodiversity Research Center on campus.
Thank you. So I studied raccoons in national parks here in Quebec. I know you're a bit more focused on urban ecology. So maybe we can go listen to you about your research and your presentation. So we'll have a better idea of what you're looking at, and that's going to direct the rest of the discussion today.
Okay, great. I will share my screen. Does that work? Can you see that?
Awesome, yes.
Okay, great. So I won't take too long, but I thought it might be helpful just to give an overview of our research and why we're interested in asking the questions that we're asking. So as you mentioned, Louis, we are focused mostly on urban mesocarnivores, and the reason we're interested in the urban environment is because I think urban environments present a really novel and challenging problem for wildlife. And urban environments are really rapidly expanding across the globe. And so as they are doing so, we're seeing more and more wildlife entering into cities, and we're seeing more and more interactions and conflict between humans and wildlife in urban spaces. So I think there's a lot of really interesting questions to ask about how wildlife are able to survive in urban environments and how urban environments are changing the behavior and the cognition and the ecology of urban wildlife. And then also trying to understand the cognition and the behavior of urban wildlife, I think will give us a much better ability to effectively manage urban wildlife populations and to reduce conflict and increase coexistence between wildlife and people in urban environments. And our work is somewhat unique in that we are really focused on cognition of wildlife in urban environments is a big part of what we're studying. And the reason why we're looking at cognition is because these urban environments really pose a lot of interesting problems for wildlife to solve. So when wildlife enter into cities, they have to find new ways of getting food. They have to develop new navigation strategies. They have to learn to avoid cars, for example, and trains. They have to deal with new predators potentially in that urban environment or competitors that they didn't have in more natural environments. And there are also a lot of ways in which they have to adjust their communication to deal with background noise. These are just some of the problems that urban wildlife encounter. And I think cognition plays a really big role in how they're able to solve these problems and to survive. So to that end, a lot of our work has been focused on looking at using this cognitive buffer hypothesis as a framework. So this cognitive buffer hypothesis is a leading hypothesis to explain the evolution of intelligence in animals, and it posits that large brains evolved primarily to help buffer individuals against environmental challenges, specifically by facilitating the construction of novel behavioral responses. And so we've examined this hypothesis in a number of ways. The first way is that we've looked at this link between bigger brains and enhanced domain general cognitive abilities. So it's often assumed that when you have a bigger brain, you're more intelligent, but in fact, that link has been, there hasn't been that much empirical evidence to support that connection. So in just one study, we presented a number of different carnivore species with a novel problem-solving task, which was this puzzle box that they had to open to get a food reward. And we asked if species with bigger brains, either absolute bigger brains or bigger brain relative to their body size, were more successful at solving the problem. And we found that they were. So relative brain size was the strongest predictor of success on this problem across all these different carnivore species. And we also have looked at within a species if we can find sort of neurobiological correlates of problem-solving performance. We've done this with raccoons, and we found that raccoons that are able to solve multiple solutions on this multi-axis puzzle box, so raccoons that display more sort of cognitive flexibility, have more cells in their hippocampus and have more of a specialized neuron type than raccoons that are not able to solve this problem as well. So we're seeing even within a species that there are sort of neurobiological characteristics that can predict problem-solving performance. And then we've also looked at this hypothesis by examining that link between innovation and survival. And to do this, we relied on data from hyenas. So I did my dissertation work with spotted hyenas in Kenya. And I presented a bunch of individuals with a novel problem-solving task, which was very similar to the one that I showed you with the carnivore study, where they had to open a box to get a food reward. And this is part of a long-term study run by my dissertation advisor, Kay Holkamp. And so we now have data on the offspring of the individuals that participated in my study. And so we were able to ask whether the cubs of innovative females survive more than the cubs of non-innovative females, or females who didn't perform very well on the task. And we found some really interesting trade-offs where innovative females have more cubs per year, so they have higher annual cub production, and they have a higher annual cub survival. However, they have overall lower reproductive success in terms of survival over a longer period of time. And so we think that there are some pretty interesting trade-offs maybe associated with being innovative, where you're potentially better at acquiring resources, but you're also potentially taking more risks, and that can then lead to a lower overall survival rate. And then we've also, in my more recent work, been looking at this connection between living in a new, unusual, or complex environmental condition, which many would argue a city is, and whether or not species that are able to live in these urban environments do in fact exhibit higher domain general cognitive abilities, and specifically whether or not they're more innovative. And so to do this, we are looking at a trait called behavior flexibility, which is sort of a multifaceted cognitive trait that encompasses things like innovative problem solving, learning, social learning, an ability to solve problems in different ways, repeated innovation, and then also inhibitory control, where you're able to stop a behavior that was successful but no longer is. So like if you're a raccoon and you learn how to open a trash can, then the owner of that trash can gets annoyed, and so they put a bungee cord on top, or they put a brick on top, and the raccoon now has to learn to not just try to open the lid in the way it was before, but to do something else. That would be inhibitory control. So we're looking at all of these different traits in raccoons. And the reason we're looking at raccoons is because they're highly successful across a huge range of different habitat types. They've spread throughout North America, and they've also been very successful in areas where they've been introduced in parts of Europe and Asia. They're very good at living in cities. They're very good at navigating through cities. They're very good at finding resources in cities. And people describe them anecdotally as being very clever. But when I was first thinking about which study system to work with, when I started my first faculty position at the University of Wyoming, I thought, well, surely there has to be a huge amount of literature out there on raccoons, because they're everywhere, they're adorable, and we think they're smart. But in fact, there's actually very little that we know about their behavior and their cognition. However, they're also very interesting from a neurobiological perspective. So this is data taken from a paper by Yardi, Messiter, and et al. And you can see here, raccoons are the red circle, primates are the triangles, and then other carnivore species are these gray filled in circles, and the white circles are artiodactyls. But this is showing their neuronal density in their cerebral cortex and in their cerebellum. And you can see that raccoons are sort of much more primate-like in terms of their neuronal density than they are compared to other carnivores. So they are very interesting, I think, from a neurobiological perspective as well. And then lastly, they're historically even described as very solitary species, but our work and work from another lab at Ohio State University, working on raccoons in Chicago, we're finding that they're more social than we thought. So this is a social network taken from one of our study sites, demonstrating to us that there is the potential here for social transmission of information and social learning. So to study the raccoons, I established the University of Wyoming Raccoon Project when I was on the faculty there, and worked with these amazing students to start looking at the cognition and the behavior and the ecology of urban raccoons. And just to briefly sum up our methods, we start out with camera traps. We figure out where the raccoons are, what they're doing, and then we start trapping raccoons where we find them in our study area. And when we trap the raccoons, we collect a number of different biological samples. We get blood and feces and hair, so we can start looking at the genetics of the population, their diet, using stable isotope analyses. We look at their health, parasite loads, etc. We also insert a PIT tag into them. So that's like a RFID tag. It's similar to a microchip you'd put in your dog at the vet in case you lose them. They can scan them and find you. So we put a PIT tag in so we can identify individuals at our experimental study sites later. And then we've also collared a handful of individuals to look at their activity patterns and home age sizes. And then once we have the individuals marked in our population, we present them with cognitive tasks. And because we're working in an urban environment, we also do a lot of outreach. So I think urban ecology research is a really wonderful opportunity to work with people in the community and to really talk about the wildlife that's in their backyards and get people involved in scientific research. So we take that very seriously and try to do a lot of outreach as part of our research. And then we also have been fortunate enough to work with a captive facility where they house raccoons for other research that they're doing on typically on rabies vaccine baits and things like that. But we've been able to present captive raccoons with cognitive tasks as well. And to briefly sum up our work in captivity, we've looked at innovative problem solving, behavioral flexibility in multiple different ways using both a multi-axis puzzle box and a reversal learning task. We've also looked at their ability to trade off between exploration and exploitation. And then we've also in the wild looked at innovative problem solving and learning, as well as behavioral flexibility using a sort of a version of a multi-axis puzzle box that would work for the wild. And then we've also recently presented wild raccoons with a reversal learning task, which you can see down there. And so we're finding that raccoons are able to solve all these problems, but they do so in somewhat novel and different ways, which I'm happy to talk about. But then we also, as part of our research, are really struck by a lot of the complaints that we receive about raccoons, that they're causing a lot of problems in urban environments. They're so-called nuisance species. And of course, we have people talking to us about this all the time as we're doing our work. And so we began to think about how cognition, while it might be enabling some species to live in urban environments, it could also be bringing a lot of individuals into conflict with humans, because those animals that are able to open the trash can or break into a garage, they're sort of the most innovative animals, but then they're also the most prone to enter into conflict potentially. And so we've been thinking a lot about the sort of cognition of so-called nuisance species as well in our work. And then finally, I just moved to UBC, as I mentioned. So we're now starting to launch the UBC Urban Wildlife Project. So with my amazing students, Hannah and Jay, we are starting with camera trapping in Vancouver. We're setting up several camera trap transects throughout the city of Vancouver. We're joining the Urban Wildlife Information Network, which is a network of cities across North America and even internationally now that are doing sort of urban camera trapping work. And then we'll be setting out some experimental sites, some cognitive experiments for the raccoons in Vancouver, and looking at a lot of the same questions, but also expanding our work to be thinking a lot more about sort of different neighborhood characteristics, how urban environments are not just sort of homogeneous, but actually neighborhoods can vary quite dramatically in terms of the resources available for wildlife and also the challenges that wildlife face. And also looking at sort of the health of raccoons in these urban environments, and also looking at human perceptions of wildlife in urban environments. So that's my whirlwind tour of what we've been up to and what we're doing.
That was great. Thank you very much. I've seen a long version of your talk. I think it was 3 years ago, and just 3 years later, I learned a bunch of new stuff that you're doing. So it's amazing. You've talked about working on raccoons in an urban setting. I work on raccoons, but I also do a lot of work on bats in parallel to my PhD. And often people would call me saying, hey, I have bats. How do I get rid of them? And I'm sure people would call you or call your students to ask such question. And how do you react to people that reach out to you for your expertise, but not in the way that you would like it?
Yeah, it's always a challenge. I think you always have to be respectful and listen to their concerns. And then we do our best to refer them to resources that are available through sites such as like the SPCA, which often will let people know, like, here are some humane solutions to wildlife problems that you might be having. But it's not within our sort of we don't have the ability to remove wildlife. And so we do tell people, you know, sometimes we'll say like this is the season when raccoon moms have kits, and we know this is a challenge, but if you just wait a couple months, you know, you can board up this hole and prevent them from coming back, but you won't separate the mom from her kits and, you know, cause problems. Or we talk about things like that, but we can't really solve the problem for people other than pointing them to the many wonderful resources that are out there, and then also just listening, you know, compassionately as best we can.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like what I say about bats. But with bat, there's the additional challenge of rabies. Do you have like a lot of raccoon rabies on the West Coast?
No, fortunately. Rabies does exist in raccoons, but it is typically limited to the East Coast. So on the West Coast, that's not as much of a concern. However, there are other zoonotic diseases that are a concern for raccoons. And so I'm a mother, I have 3 young children. I completely understand the need to keep one's family safe and children who crawl around and put everything in their mouths. So it's a concern, but again, we can point people to the resources, like here are studies about these diseases, here's what we know, here's the best way to sort of clean up after a raccoon, like pour boiling water on feces when you find them. Is, you know, you clean up the feces and then pour boiling water. But in general, the risk is very low for transmission of diseases from raccoons to people.
So, absolutely. You talked about the advantage of studying an abundant species, but some people might argue that in a time of conservation concern and biodiversity loss, there might be less of a need of studying abundant and unthreatened species. What would you reply to that concern?
I would reply that in many ways, I understand, you know, their point, and I think there's a huge need to study threatened and endangered species, of course. But I do think there's tremendous value in studying urban species, and that is for several reasons. First, urban areas are expanding rapidly. We're only going to be seeing an increase in urbanization as we go forward. And so I think that to really be able to conserve a lot of species in the long run, we need to be focused a lot on coexistence in addition to conservation. And so to better to sort of facilitate coexistence with wildlife in human-dominated landscapes, I think we need to be studying these species that have been able to successfully adapt to human-disturbed environments and understand why and how they've been able to do that. And I think then we might hopefully learn lessons from that work about how to help species that aren't as successful in adapting to urban environments. I mean, basic research often leads to unexpected and very valuable discoveries. So there's just value in all basic research. But I do think that human wildlife conflict is only going to become an increasing problem as these urban areas are expanding, unless we get a better handle on how to effectively manage wildlife in urban environments. And that, I think, will have massive consequences for people and for wildlife going forward.
I'm going to move on a bit more on animal behavior. So if we search for scientific papers about cognition on the internet, a lot of the results will be about research that have been done in lab setting, in very controlled environment. But like you do, like I do, we study cognition and behavior in the field. So and I sure have strong feelings that it's very important to study cognition in the field, but what would you bring up what is the advantage of studying cognition in natural setting versus a lab setting?
I think captive work is very valuable. I do captive work as well. So there's a lot of inherent value in it. But I think the best thing we can do with captive work is to really understand the cognitive capacity of a species. So in captive work, you have this beautiful controlled environment, and you can really get at what are sort of the maximal abilities of this species in that controlled environment. And you get really clean results. You don't have a lot of interference from other individuals, right? You don't have like the issues with social groups that we have in the wild. So you can get a really clear understanding of the cognitive capabilities of a species. But I think that work in natural environment is really critical to being able to understand the relevance of a cognitive ability for a species and how they actually use that ability in real life. And so just because they might possess an ability doesn't mean that they actually use it to that same degree in the real environment. And so the term we like to use in our field is ecological validity, right? You really need to sort of validate the function of an ability and how an animal truly uses it to be able to understand its real importance to an animal. And that I think you can only really get by studying an animal in its natural environment.
Yeah, but studying animal behavior in the field brings up its share of challenges, obviously. How often do the raccoons like counter your experiment? I mean, you're giving them a challenge, a task, and you expect them to try it in such way, but that's what they do with my own experiments. Sometimes they just find the third option that I didn't think about to solve the problem. Is that something that you encounter regularly with raccoons or other species that you studied?
Definitely, yes. But we see that in both captivity and in the wild. So that's just a ubiquitous problem. I'll give you a great example of this, which was the Aesop's Fable study we did with the captive raccoons. This was one of our first studies with raccoons, and it was led by Lauren Stanton, who's a former PhD student in my lab, and she's now a postdoc at UC Berkeley. And Lauren presented raccoons with an Aesop's Fable task. So an Aesop's Fable task is a very classic assessment of causal understanding in the comparative cognition literature, and it's based on the Aesop's Fable, The Crow and the Pitcher. So in the Aesop's Fable, The Crow and the Pitcher, a thirsty crow finds a pitcher of water, but the water level is too low for the crow to be able to reach it. But this crow figures out, very clever crow, that it could pick up stones and drop them into the pitcher, and that would raise the water level up to the point where it could reach it and take a drink. And so this fable has been the inspiration for this cognitive task where different animal species, it's mostly been corvids and human children, have been presented with a clear cylinder with water in it, and then the animals have to figure out how to drop stones in to get a food reward, to be able to reach the water. And often there's a food reward like floating on it. So we presented this to raccoons, and we had a floating marshmallow on top of the water. And first it had never been presented to a mammalian carnivore. So we said, all right, we don't really know how they're going to respond to this, so let's just give it to them. And we thought they might do quite well because raccoons are very familiar with the properties of water. They live, in riparian environments. They're often around streams. So we thought there might be a chance that they just do really well with this task, but they didn't. And this is not unexpected. I mean, in the corvid studies, they also had to train, basically shape the behavior of the corvids to get them to drop the stones into the tube. So we did that with the raccoons, and they dropped the stones. We trained a few of them to drop the stones in to get the food reward. But the real sort of thing with Aesop's Fable are these choice tasks, and that really tells you how much they understand. So once you've trained them to drop the stones in, you then present them with choice tasks, which are like bigger stones versus smaller stones, or something that floats versus something that sinks. And you say, all right, if they really understand the properties of sort of the physics of this problem, then they'll choose the most efficient choice, right? They'll choose the bigger stones over the smaller stones, or they'll choose the functional object, the sinking stone versus the floating object, right? And the corvids do this. They pick the bigger stone, they drop one in, they get their reward, and they're done, right? But the raccoons just picked up all the stones and tossed them all in, because they're very playful, they're very curious and exploratory. And they would take stones and hide them in their bedding so they could play with them later. And they just did all these things that we weren't expecting. But they also learned that they could take the floating ball and push it down, and that would splash the water up the side of the tube, and they could then get like sweet little bits of marshmallow from off the side of the tube. So this is just one example, but it shows you sort of the different ways in which raccoons approach problems, and then also how they can solve problems in unexpected ways.
Absolutely. I have two types of puzzle box as well. One of light. One of them is similar to your the box, the square one. I'm just gonna continue. And one is more of a tube, sliding tubes, hollow tubes that they have to slide and align two holes so that they can get to the rewards. And some of them would just like pull it out from the stakes that are in the ground and roll it around until the door opened. So I had to find ways to peg it more strongly to the ground because they just found another way to open the box. So staying on the topic of cognition, I've seen a lot of articles in the past decade saying that all the knowledge that we gain from studying animal behavior is rarely or poorly translated to wildlife management practices. So there are two kind of fields in biology, and they're not integrated enough together so that wildlife managers use animal behavior knowledge to their advantage. Do you have an opinion on why there might be this kind of wall between the two still, and what would we gain as a society to consider more animal behavior when we manage wildlife?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think it often is the case that you have fields that start off as separate, and then they become very important to one another, but it takes a while for them to really fully merge or to really, adopt what's going on in the other field, just because you get momentum, right? And you get these sort of cultural differences and practices in different fields, publishing in different places. And so it's easy to not have conversations across fields as much as we should. But I do think we're starting to change that. So I know there's been a number of different sort of talks in like animal behavior conferences lately, really thinking more about how animal behavior is relevant for conservation and also for wildlife management. We had a symposium at the last animal behavior conference that was solely focused on this topic, thinking about how animal behavior and cognition can inform wildlife management policy and decisions. So I think we're making progress on that front, but obviously there's much more progress to be made. But I do think that there's a lot that animal behavior and cognition can do to aid in management. And I think that, like, for example, many of the sort of more common non-lethal conflict mitigation strategies that we have are most often overcome by animal cognition, right? Like animals learn to habituate to things. They learn to avoid scarecrows or traps or poisons. And so really, if we want more effective mitigation tools, we need to really gain a better understanding of how animals learn, so that we can design things that will be harder for them to habituate to. So I think there's a lot that we need to do there, and we're getting there slowly.
Yeah, planning for my research, from the start, I wanted to work in the national parks here in Quebec. So I really worked collaboratively with national parks. So I have quite a good hear from them, and hopefully, eventually, I'll be able to have discussions with them to help them better deal with raccoons in their parks. Do you have a good communication with, say, the cities where you've been working, either in Laramie in Wyoming or Vancouver?
Yeah, we do. I mean, Laramie is a pretty small town, so it's 30,000 people in that town, and it's a town that's surrounded by parks and ranches, and sort of, it's not just like city, right? So it's a pretty isolated town, and because it's small, sort of everyone gets to know everyone there. So we had a good working relationship with the city and with the sort of state, Fish and Game Wildlife Department. And then in Vancouver, I've been very fortunate to have pretty quickly gotten to know people in the wildlife department and in the city, and I'm working on some collaborations with them right now. So I think that I'm really excited to set up our system here and to get working here, because I think that there will be a lot that we can do in terms of understanding what's happening with urban wildlife in Vancouver, and then also working really well with the city and the provincial authorities.
So speaking about this topic of human wildlife interaction, that's the term I use, interaction. We often read conflict, coexistence. Do you have a preferred term that you use in your communication, either for the general public or when you're writing scientific papers?
No, I see the value in all the terms. So I think, I understand that there's obviously negative implications when you say the word conflict. And so in many situations, human wildlife interactions are not negative, right? We have many, I would say, argue that most human wildlife interactions in urban environments are actually positive or neutral. So to label all interactions as human wildlife conflict obviously gives it a very negative spin. However, I do think there is a role and a time to label things as conflict if that is in fact what's going on. And so I do think that there's value in both terms. It just depends on what you're talking about.
And the human wildlife, say, interactions are extremely complex. Do you, and we can look at it from both sides, either the wildlife or the human one. For my research, for example, I focus on the wildlife, on the animal perception, the animal cognition, and I might eventually work more on the human side. Therefore, creating outreach material to educate people that visit national parks to change their behavior. How much effort do you put on the human side of the conflict? I've seen in your presentation that you and your students doing a lot of outreach. How important is it for you to educate the general public?
I think it's critically important. I think that we're not going to be very successful at establishing sort of coexistence with wildlife in urban areas if we don't look at the human side as well as the wildlife side. So we can study raccoons or coyotes or other, urban wildlife as much as we want, and gain a really great understanding of how they learn and how their behavior is changing, and sort of good strategies to reduce conflict in urban areas. But without the human side to it, I don't think we'll be very successful in the long run. So I think that outreach is really critically important, but then also I think it's just a really wonderful opportunity. So for many people living in cities, they're not getting out to big parks. They're not, going on safari or whatever, right? And so they don't, for many people in an urban environment, like urban wildlife is their sort of the way in which they can connect to the natural world. And so I think it's a really wonderful opportunity for us as scientists to strengthen that connection and to do what we can to involve people in our research, to give opportunities for people to collect data, to participate in sort of community science projects, and to just give people information about here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's what we're learning, so people can say, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that raccoons were capable of X, Y, and Z, right? And that's what I'm seeing in my backyard. And oh, that makes a lot more sense now as to why they're doing that, right? So I just think it's really important for the wildlife, but also just a really wonderful opportunity to help society.
Yeah, and I mean, if it's even just like studying the animal behavior, then sharing the results to the general public, I think it can amaze people how animal can be complex and how they have personalities. That's another part of animal behavior, personality. Each individual animal is different. So by showing that to the people, they're gonna make this connection more easily with wildlife, and then they're gonna care for it.
Yeah, exactly. It also, I think, is a nice opportunity for us, right? I mean, we can learn from people as well, so they can tell us things that we didn't know, like, oh, I'm seeing this, and we can say, oh, that's really interesting, let's explore that further. So I think it can go both ways, obviously.
Yeah, this is very important as well. I want to bring you back just a little bit to your PhD. So you worked on spotted hyenas. You did field work in Kenya, is that right?
Yes.
So human-wildlife interactions are, I believe they are quite different when we look at, say, the North American context and urban wildlife, or peri-urban, like what I do, and human-wildlife interactions in some countries in the global South. You've had experience in Kenya. I've been to West Africa, South America. How do you think that the human-wildlife interaction affects people differently in the city in North America versus people in Kenya that you've interacted with?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak obviously to all of the global South. As you say, I have experience in East Africa mostly, and I've studied hyenas there and also elephants, and it's a really challenging situation because the consequences for hyenas eating livestock, or elephants trampling or eating crops, are really dire for people who are living in these communities, like adjacent to national parks and reserves. And for many people, it's really a matter of life and death for their family. And so it's unrealistic to expect that we can just say, we need to protect the wildlife, so deal with it. Like, that's just not a reasonable expectation. And so it's a really challenging situation. And I think that yeah, the consequences are just much more sort of severe for people in those communities. And so it makes it even more critical to work on these problems there and to try to find ways to reduce the number of conflicts that we're seeing in terms of elephants crop raiding and things like that. And so there's really wonderful people doing amazing research. Sherman De Silva is a friend and colleague who's coming to UBC soon, and she does amazing work with Asian elephants as just one example. But I really applaud what people are doing in the global South, and I think it's really critically important to do what we can to help wildlife, but also at the same time to be doing everything that we can to help the communities that are affected by wildlife.
Yeah, one of my colleagues in my lab is studying elephants-human conflict around national parks in Cameroon. And when we exchange about our experience, although we study the same topic, it's very different experience, yeah, for sure.
It is, and I think it's also important to acknowledge that the impacts of wildlife on human communities, even within North America, can be very different depending on income and other factors, right? So that although we might be studying raccoons in Vancouver, you know, in some neighborhoods, we're going to be seeing very different consequences in terms of the interactions than we're seeing in other neighborhoods. So I think looking at human wildlife interactions through keeping in mind all of these other sort of factors that are influencing human communities is really important.
Absolutely. I've seen a question here in the chat. I think it's a very interesting one. So I'm gonna go right away and ask about it. So did you, and I'm just gonna say first that when doing my my puzzle box experiments, I use scent bait, marshmallow, and sardines. I don't know what you use as bait, but the question is there an effect of the bait you're putting it and the efforts of the animals trying to solve the problem? Is there an effect of the bait on the actual interaction the animals have with the experiment? Did you try different baits and seen any impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. Motivation is a massive issue. Yes, it can be a big challenge in terms of our cognitive experiments, because we want to ensure that the conclusions that we're drawing from the experiment are in fact it's showing us the cognitive abilities of an animal, not just their motivation level. So if an animal is uninterested or unmotivated to solve the problem, then we're going to see a very different result than if they're right. So we do, at the start of an experiment for our captive work, before deciding on which bait to use, we tested a number of different ones, sort of like a food preference test, and just asked them, what do you like? And we tried to pick the food that was preferred by the most individuals. And we also sometimes use a mix of food. So we'll use, like a sardine that's quite stinky, and then also some dog kibble or something, or a marshmallow or something that they like. They also tend to really like prunes. So we've just experimented by presenting as many animals as we can with a few different choices of each thing and seeing what they like. For the experiment where we were looking across a number of different species of carnivores, because it was a zoo-based study, we spoke with the keepers beforehand and found out what was the favorite food of the animal that we were working with, and we presented them with that. So, they all got a different bait depending on what they really like. And for hyenas, typically they go for pretty much anything, but a lot of it was just raw meat, goat or whatever was available, or ribs from the supermarket. Everyone kept thinking I was having really big cookouts or something, because I would go and buy like these massive boxes of frozen ribs. Yeah.
So there's 10 minutes left. I'm going to ask my big question. What do you think is the future of animal behavior studies? Are there any topics that did not receive enough attention so far that you think that future students should put more attention to in the next 10 years, let's say?
So I can think of a few sort of trends in animal behavior that I'm really excited about. So I'll start there to see if this answers the question. But at the last Animal Behavior Conference, Karen Workington gave a plenary talk on sort of the value of diversity, sort of the value of diverse perspectives in terms of the questions that we ask in animal behavior, and also in terms of our interpretation of the data that we're seeing and our observations of animal behavior. And I'm really excited about the way the field is embracing diversity and the potential that has for the field going forward. I think that obviously we can do a lot better in terms of the diversity that we have in ecology and zoology and animal behavior, cognition, in terms of the scientists that are doing the work, right? We need more people doing the work from all backgrounds, because those perspectives are so incredibly valuable. So I think that's a huge part of the future, is just welcoming these diverse perspectives and really listening and seeing the really wonderful sort of ways in which people's perspectives take us in terms of studying animal behavior. Another one is what we've already touched on, but I think it's the integration of animal behavior even more into conservation and management and human-wildlife interaction studies. So this is something that has been happening, but I think is still sort of in its infancy in many respects. And so I think there's a lot of potential there and growth to be had in that direction. And also a critical need, honestly, like we really need to do everything we can at this point to aid with conservation and wildlife management. So that I think has a lot of value. And then the other way in which I think the field is growing is by embracing technological advances. So I think there's some really exciting work that's being done that couldn't have been done even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, just based on the rapid advancement of tech. So one example of this is Jen Smith from Mills College, her recent work where she was able to look at interactions of California ground squirrels in their burrows underground using RFID technology, which is so basically getting a view of this like hidden world of these animals, which we didn't have before. And the recent science paper by Lucy Aplin and Barbara Klump and colleagues looking at social learning and cultural transmission of sort of trash bin opening behaviors in sulfur-crested cockatoos in Australia, I think is another example of really tapping into these community science networks that didn't exist before, using things like Zooniverse and iNaturalist, and also using artificial intelligence and advances in artificial intelligence to start identifying wildlife species on camera traps and things like that, I think are going to be tremendously valuable and enable us to answer a host of questions that we haven't been able to answer before. So I think students who can sort of bring technological advances to animal behavior, I think that's a really wonderful way to go.
Oh, I liked all your answers. It's exciting. I think,
Good.
I think there's a bright future for animal behavior. and that's a nice field to go into. I have time for another question. That one's good. Is there a difference in the performance in, let's say, problem solving between individuals? Like, do you see an impact of personality on problem solving ability? I think I see it, but I haven't done analyzing all of my data, so I don't have the hard proof, but obviously there are great difference between individuals. Have you seen it either in raccoons or other animals?
Yes. Yeah, I think individual personality or temperament is really critical. And we've seen it in hyenas and in elephants and in zebra finches and raccoons. So I think, so for example, with hyenas, social rank in hyenas is this really critical factor in terms of how they access resources, their everyday interactions. They have this really strict dominance hierarchy. And I was really expecting in our puzzle box experiments and other experiments to find an effective rank on our results, but we didn't. Rank didn't have any influence in how animals performed. Neither did sex. All these things I thought would be important. But really what we saw was just that it came down to individual differences. Some hyenas are just interested and better, and other ones aren't. And then we also, in raccoons, Lauren Stanton has a paper that's in review right now, where we are finding this really interesting effect where shyer individuals, we did a temperament assessment with the raccoons, and we found that the shyer individuals were actually better on a reversal learning task than the bolder individuals, which I think has a lot of really important implications in terms of management. So bold individuals may be the ones who are approaching you for food, right, and scaring you, but it might actually be the shyer individuals who are able to figure out how to break into your chicken coop or whatever it might be, right? And so from a long-term management perspective, the shyer animals might actually be more of a problem than the bolder ones, in terms of, or at least in terms of different sort of forms of conflict that we might be seeing. And yes, we've seen this in other species as well. So I think that individual variation is really critical.
So if there's difference in problem solving ability, or things like that, do you think that there might be some selection depending on the environment where the animal is living? So let's say you have your urban raccoons versus the raccoons that live in the forest 10 miles away. Through those cognitive ability, do you think that both populations might, if they're isolated enough, might separate even more based on their cognitive difference? Or
yeah,
in different contexts?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are some really really fascinating results showing that there seem to be personality differences in terms of which individuals are sort of at the front of a range expansion, right? So as a species is expanding its range into new areas, it's the bolder individuals that are in the front of that expansion, right? And then you have shyer individuals or less exploratory individuals sort of in the back or in the middle. So I do, and that was done with a bird species, I believe in East Africa somewhere, but really cool, fascinating results, right? So I do think there's a potential for finding some separation of individuals based on personality traits or other factors in different areas. And I do think you could argue that perhaps urban environments may be selecting for bolder individuals. Maybe they're better able to acquire anthropogenic resources in urban environments. You could also argue the opposite. I don't know actually which direction it would go, but I think you could make an argument that there would be an effect of urbanization on sort of this selection in terms of different personality traits. But I think it would be, it'd be interesting to study that. I'm not positive you'd get that result, but I think there's a potential.
I believe we would need a big and long-term data set to really answer that question properly. Maybe a last question, Anna. I'm gonna read Jennifer's question here on the chat. She's working on wildlife crossing structure, and she often sees raccoons traveling in groups, and she finds their behavior to be very interesting. Is there social transmission in raccoons? Do they learn by teaching or looking at other raccoons? Do you see any example of that in your research?
The short answer is we don't know. The long air answer is I very much suspect that there is, but we just don't have the data yet to prove that there is. But that's something we're actively working on. So we're designing experiments right now to specifically assess social learning. And then I think also with our the social network that I showed in that presentation, we're able to get that social network from the pit tag data that we get when individuals enter and leave our experimental sites. So we know who's there at the same time, and we have a cognitive test out at that experimental site, so we can use different statistical techniques like network-based diffusion analyses is one example, where you can look at the spread of information along the social network, and the pattern of that spread will tell you whether that information is being spread socially or whether it's just being like individually acquired via trial and error learning or something like that. So I think we can look at it that way, and we can also look at it in these experiments that we're setting up. But that is definitely one of the next major questions that we'll be tackling in our work is the whether or not we see social learning and how important it is for raccoons in these urban environments.
Happy to hear that you're gonna work on that. Exciting. Hello, Anna.
Hi. I'm busting in. I don't know, Louis, if you have any final words to say, and then I'll take over.
Well, I want to thank you, Sarah, and I want to thank Fourth Space to make it possible to have this conversation today. It just, for obvious reason, I decided to study this topic of human-wildlife interaction and animal behavior. But having the chance to talk about it with you, Sarah, today, I really enjoyed it, and I thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you again for the invitation. It's been really wonderful to chat with you. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. And Sarah, it's been wonderful to get to know you through your work in this way. Thank you so much for coming on board. We appreciate you being here, time difference and all. Louis, you're a real pro. You just handled this so very well. We're so very proud to work with you. And just for the folks still tuned in on YouTube and in the Zoom, I'll let you know that Louis has recorded a sort of lab walk with us at Fourth Space, where he took us into the forest, I guess virtually, and showed kind of gave us access into his research world, and we'll be launching that today. So it's a short video that you can watch to learn more about the research that he does. So please check out our social media, CU Fourth Space, Concordia University Fourth Space, if you want the link to that coming out later today or maybe tomorrow. Thank you for the engaged audience members. Your questions are very much appreciated. Sorry we didn't get to absolutely all of them, but them's are the breaks, as they say. All right, on that note, folks, I'll remind you that we did live stream to YouTube, so if you want to go revisit this conversation at any point, just check out Concordia University Fourth Space on YouTube and you'll find it there. Thanks everyone for being here with us. We'll see you next time. Take good care. Bye.